Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stan Sklarov. I'm the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and it's a delight to see all of you here today, a Friday afternoon in Boston. Red Sox are getting ready to play an important game this evening. This is one of the highlights of the year, the Gitner Family Lecture. And we're especially delighted to welcome those of you who are here for BU Alumni Weekend, who've come from far and wide, some of you local, some other places around the United States and elsewhere. Today we will hear about a topic that affects all of us and worries many of us: aging. Our speaker, Debbie Carr, is an expert on aging in America. She's the author of the book with that same name, Aging in America, and a frequent commentator on this topic in the media. Perhaps more importantly, she is an Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of Sociology and the director of the Center of Innovation in Social Science, an interdisciplinary center within the College of Arts and Sciences that serves the whole university and elevates research and education and innovation in the social sciences across all of BU. It's interdisciplinary in the true sense that faculty and students are working together with other faculty and students from across all BU schools and colleges. And Debbie is the leader of that center. The center itself is celebrating its 5th anniversary this year. Its remit is to forge collaboration and multidisciplinary research, training future generations in the social sciences, and demonstrating the purpose and promise of the social sciences to improve human lives at all ages. So I'm going to go off script for just a moment and say that regularly we get together with groups of undergraduate students just for a lunch to check in, unstructured conversations about what it's like to be a BU student now, or what it's like to be a College of Arts and Sciences student now. And there, at a recent gathering of students, I think it was last spring, students were talking about their careers and what they thought they might do on graduation. There was a philosophy student who said that they were concerned that their parents couldn't understand what their career possibilities were, and I encouraged them by saying that philosophy is the universal major. You can do just about anything. You're a critical thinker, you can frame problems, and you can pose them from different viewpoints, and you are well equipped for the world. Another student was a social sciences major and said that she had her first experience in working with faculty through the Center for Innovation in Social Sciences. As an undergraduate, working with faculty in, I think in a project that spanned multiple schools involving a social science faculty member in arts and sciences. And she said that she finally understood all the career possibilities that could be open to her and how important study in the social sciences was for the future. So it's centers like this where first it sounds like it's about faculty doing research, but in fact it's about faculty working with students to do research and consider questions that matter and change the world and enable our students to do that after graduation. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to thank Jerry Gitner and his family for making this event possible. Jerry graduated in 1966 with a BA in history. He was elected to Phi Alpha Theta, the National History Honor Society. And since graduating, he has served as the CEO and chairman of the board of Trans World Airlines, vice chair of Pan American World Airways, CEO of Pan Am World Services, and president and co-founder of People Express Airlines. He's now a principal of Cross-Continental Capital and chairman of the Global Aero Holdings Limited and DG Associates. He's also an emeritus trustee member of the BU Board of Trustees, and a current member or an emeritus member of the Dean's Advisory Board of Arts and Sciences. Jerry and his family established the annual Gitner Family Lecture to highlight thought leaders whose teaching, research, or service addresses topics of major importance for the broad interest and benefit of the BU community. We are very fortunate to have alumni like Jerry who can support and facilitate the opportunities for us to gather and engage as a community on critical topics like the one we will hear about today. I also want to thank and introduce another member of our Dean's Advisory Board, Scott Webster. Scott is a double BU alum. He graduated from CAS in 1993 and then went to law school, eventually serving as chair of the ERISA and executive compensation practice at the Boston law firm Goodwin Procter. In 2023, Scott decided to embark on another degree at Boston University, and he's now pursuing his master's in social work from the BU School of Social Work. He will be completing his degree this coming May. We're pleased to have him join us on campus this alumni weekend and so grateful for his willingness to serve as a moderator today. I'll hand it over to Scott to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Stan. As Dean Sklarov mentioned, Deborah Carr is an Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Center of Innovation in Social Science. She specializes in using survey data and quantitative methods to study social factors linked with health and well-being later in life. She has written extensively on inequality in old age, death and dying, bereavement, family relationships over the life course, and the stigma associated with health conditions, including obesity and disability. Today, we will hear from Debbie on the topic of aging, specifically who in our society has the privilege of aging well. This is an incredibly important question as we continue to live longer with each generation. Debbie will explore how social, economic, and environmental factors can shape the health of older adults physically, emotionally, socially, and financially. Please join me in welcoming Debbie Carr.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and it's a pleasure to see all of you today. Thank you for taking time out of the barbecues and pub crawls that I know go along with the reunion to come to the lecture today. And as you heard, I will be talking about the topic golden years, growing old in the 21st century. Before starting, I just want to reiterate the gratitude that Stan just shared with the Gitner family for generously supporting this lecture series, to Scott for moderating and reading my book and buying my book, more importantly, and then to the CIS faculty, staff, and students and alumni who work so hard for this university every day to make sure that our students and faculty and postdocs can just thrive and prosper. So thank you for that. So here's the question, are later years really golden? And if all that you know about old age comes from the pharmaceutical ads you see when we're watching Jeopardy at 7:30 every night, you would say that the answer is indeed yes. We often see images like these of married couples who are happy, they're gardening, they're on yachts, they're dancing, and their lives are wonderful. And for them, the older years are in fact golden, but for everybody else, it might not necessarily be the case. So I think the question for us to talk about today is not, are the later years golden, but for whom and why and how, and what can we do to ensure that all people have that potential to attain golden years. There are many older adults who are living on the edges of society, and these are people we don't see. Our paths don't cross theirs, and we sometimes forget about the fact that there are over 150,000 unhoused older adults, about 9% are food insecure. So all of the problems associated with poverty and adversity that we see in younger populations are just as common among older adults, but we don't often see that. But there are also many, many positive aspects of aging, which I'll of course talk about as well today. But we just want to emphasize the fact that older adults are just as varied with respect to age, right? A 65-year-old and a 95-year-old have about as much in common as a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old. They differ on the basis of economic resources, education, religion, preferences, personality. When we think about aging policy or just how we interact with older adults in our own lives, we really need to recognize that everybody's an individual with their own resources and their own challenges. So, as you can probably tell, this is a topic I care about deeply. And as I tell undergraduates in my class, you should care about this deeply as well, because any profession that you're going into, from banking to marketing to medicine, you will be interacting with older adults as clients, as peers, as colleagues. And for those of us who operate in the world of demography of aging, this is something did I go the wrong way? This is something we look at all the time. Our population is aging at an unprecedented pace, right? Today, about 18% of all people in the United States are ages 65 plus, and that will be 25% by the year 2060. And that's 1 in 4 people will be over the age of 65. We have never been at that point of having such an older society. And even though the actual numbers are a little bit lower, the age 85 plus population is increasing at a very steep pace. And even more so, the number of centenarians is increasing at a very steep pace. And as some of you might know, BU is home actually to the New England Centenarian Study, which is an amazing resource if you want to understand the lives of people 100 years old and older. So we have a lot of older adults, and it's becoming even more so as we move along through future history. But the United States is not the center of the universe. We are part of a larger world. Most other countries also are aging at a very, very rapid pace today. And so here you can see projections from 2025 today on the left-hand side, and then 2050 on the right-hand side. Some parts of the world, specifically Asia and Southern Europe, are aging at such a tremendous pace that in a few short decades, in Hong Kong, for instance, nearly half of the population will be age 65 and older. In other parts of Asia, closer to 40%. And this is a function of a range of things. One is lower birth rates, right? If you have fewer small people, then the proportion of the entire population, age 65 plus, increases. But likewise, due to medical technologies and medical advances, older adults are living longer than ever before. So at a population level, this is an issue that will affect every single one of us. No matter what we do in our career or in our lives, this is something that we are going to be greeting in our future. But it also matters personally for all of us, for those who are 5, those who are 50, and those who are 95. Aging is personal, and for those who are transitioning into their later years, there are challenges like finding meaning in retirement, finding a new life after one leaves their career job. For many people, even in their 40s and 50s, 60s and older, caring for a family member, especially those with dementia. Those of you who are of my generation, kind of the geriatric Gen Xers, you know your first 5 minutes with your friends will be focusing on your new aches and pains that you didn't have last year, and then you'll quickly segue into talking about the challenges of having a parent or an in-law with dementia. And even when you're a topic specialist, those are really sticky problems to navigate and very, very challenging. And so for the older adults themselves, their children, their grandchildren, these are challenges that we all face. For other older adults, especially those who are at the wealthier end of the continuum, watching investments go up and down. Will those savings last through the needs for long-term care, for instance? Or will savings last to be able to provide and leave something to one's offspring as one kind of progresses through life? Other challenges, thinking about where we live, making homes age-friendly. This is a challenge that many people have, especially if you're a New Englander. In New England, we have very old houses, and very few of us have central air, so putting in an air conditioner is very hard if you're 50. It's really hard if you're 90. Most homes in New England do not have a first-floor full bath, for instance. So these are issues that even if you don't think about it when you're 25, you will think about it a lot when you're 75. And then again, navigating long-term care, which I think is just one of the biggest challenges we have in this country, both because it's costly and because we have a labor shortage that will become even more so with punitive immigration policies. Who will care for our older adults? We can no longer care for them in our homes. So this is something that really matters for all of us. Again, whether we are the one aging, and we're all going to age if we're so lucky to actually make it to that point. So this is something really personal, I suspect, for everyone in the room. But with that said, when you study population aging, there's something that reporters do that actually really, really annoys me, so I will share that with you today. Oftentimes, population aging is discussed in these very foreboding tones. There's a gray tsunami and a silver hurricane is going to destroy everything in its path. That is a harmful metaphor to me. I think it promotes ageism. It promotes this perception that older adults are going to take resources and give nothing back into the pot. And I think that's an unfair way to think about this. So we just want to keep that in the back of our minds. Even when I identify some of the challenges that we face as an aging society, we need to recognize that it's not the aging populations that are causing challenges for us as we move along. We need to repair our world. We need to set up the structures and community support so that we can accommodate older adults, because we are very fortunate to have people living to their 70s, 80s, and 90s, both as grandparents, as caregivers, volunteers, as consumers, as carriers of memory and culture. Older adults give back so much, and I think sometimes they're often portrayed as a population who's taking resources rather than giving resources back. And so on that note, when you think about some of the portrayals of older adults, and specifically aging baby boomers who are born in between 46 and 64, it's that large cohort of 75 million births born back in the 40s and 50s who are marching into old age. Baby boomers get a bad rap in the media, right? We know that during COVID, there was this nonsense of, okay, boomer, kind of this very snide way of interacting with older adults. But even more generally, when you look at some of the news headlines that talk about the experiences of older adults, like how the boomers are robbing the rest of us, greedy geezers, these are headlines that you will still see. And the one that I found most problematic as someone who studies inequality and aging is this one up top here, which was by an economist, actually, by Samuelson. Don't expand Social Security. Our elderly are mostly fine. Okay, let's not expand Social Security because our elderly are mostly fine. That's an argument that you hear out there. So let's see, are they mostly fine? Well, here, this is a chart that shows poverty rates over time. And I don't know if I can get this red thing going here. There we go, red thing. Okay, so here I'll just gesture. Here, these three green lines are the percent who live under the federal poverty line, which is essentially just your household have enough money to pay for the food that you need, right? Poverty lines are a very simple measure. And so look what happened to that pink line. Back in 1959, 1 in 3 older adults lived in poverty. And I don't know if it's true or not, or a wives' tale, that Walter Cronkite talked about older people eating cat food and dog food, right? This was a real crisis, late life poverty. Well, what happened? Social Security was expanded in the 70s, or late 60s through 70s, and late life poverty, that pink line, went from 35% all the way to 9%. So today, in fact, if you look at the 3 main age groups, children under 18, working age adults, 18 to 64, which is the green line are the adults, the blue line are kids. Older adults look like they're doing pretty well. Just 9% overall live in poverty, compared to 10% of working age persons and 16% of children. Again, all of these things are a travesty, especially 16% of children living in poverty. But some people will look at that statistic and say, 9%, yeah, that's pretty good. Why do we have to keep giving those baby boomers money? Why don't they need their Social Security? Well, I would argue an aggregate level statistic in any field conceals heterogeneity. It hides those differences that we all need to know about. And so here are just a couple of quick stats to walk you through this. This is just a very basic chart. Using that same measure, percent living in poverty, we see that it ranges very dramatically on the basis of gender. There's a tremendous feminization of poverty in the United States at every age, but women are more likely than men to be poor. And the older you get, your risk of poverty declines as you spend down all of those savings you have, and you especially spend down all those savings in order to pay for long-term care. So we see among older adults, maybe it's 9% overall, but tremendous variation on the basis of gender and age. And now if we carry even one more layer, if we bring race and ethnicity into the equation here, you can see there are dramatic differences where women of color have a poverty rate of 20%, which is really quite dramatic. And if I was going to use all kinds of data up here and showed the multiple factors of gender and marital status and race, you would see that about 2 to 3% of white married men live in poverty, and more like 30% of Black and Hispanic women who are on their own. So that 9%, everyone's doing okay, really is a very misleading situation. So when we think about policies, right, when we think about blanket policies, one important thing that we want to consider moving forward is thinking about ways to meet the needs of the most disadvantaged members of our society. So that's one story. Yeah, they're doing okay, but not overall. Another story we hear is that health is great. Older adults are doing better and better. Why? Because they're living longer and longer, right? And we always have these great examples. And anyone here who's a runner, when you're crossing the finish line of your 10K or half marathon, there's always someone, at least because I'm very slow, like running next to me, and then I check their score, and they're like 75 years old, and they're still beating me. So we all know that there are athletes out there, super athletes in their 70s and 80s. We know the oldest climber of Mount Everest here, Miura, climbed Mount Everest at age 80. So we have lots of images. Older adults are strong and robust, which is amazing. These are great role models that we want to live up to. Another indication that older adults are doing fine in terms of health is this rising life expectancy. For the most part, each year, going back about 100 years, Americans and people worldwide are living longer and longer. We've had a little blip during COVID and some leveling off since then. But on the whole, if you were going to look just at this chart here and just at the rates of things like heart disease, for instance, it might look like, yeah, we're doing much better, right? And in fact, we are. But another scenario where if you dig into the data and you start to think about disparities, they are very stark. So here, we have widening life expectancy gaps on the basis of educational attainment. So again, this is another chart over time. Maybe I'll point to this one here. Going just the short time period from 2000 to 2019, the pink people are basically us, college graduates, right? Our life expectancy is not only the longest, but it's widening over time. And so we actually see there are a range of reasons why the health returns to education are increasing over time. We've had a couple of major health crises over the past decade beyond COVID, and all of those health crises disproportionately affect the lives of those who have fewer resources. So for instance, COVID, we know, was much more common if someone's working in a frontline job like a bus driver and not a professor who's teaching via Zoom, for instance. Also rates of obesity, rates of smoking, even rates of suicide in recent years have been much higher among those who face much more economic adversity. And so this is something that we're seeing. People are indeed all living longer, which is a gift, but some are living longer than others, and that gap is growing, which suggests a challenge that we have as a society. So some folks might be thinking, what's the role of biology in all of this? Right? We all know that with advancing age, biology matters. And that is indeed the case. If you talk to 100-year-olds and you ask them, how did you live to be 100 years old? They'll usually say good genes. That's the first thing they say. And then oddly, they always say something like a bottle of whiskey a week, and something like that, or stay single. They always have these very pithy quotes. But referencing good genes is something that they often mention. And in fact, biology absolutely is part of this equation for longevity. And we all know that there's some universals of aging that happen and that affect our bodies. And this is going to happen to every single one of us, right? Things like aerobic capacity diminishes, right? It's harder to run up the stairs now than it was 10 years ago. Regulation in temperature, it's harder as you get older to regulate in extreme heat or extreme cold. Immune response, right? We get sicker more easily if we're older. So there are, in fact, biological realities that are going to affect all of us and will affect all of our health. But they matter differently, and they occur in different intensities and at different ages based on social factors. And so there's something called accelerated aging. We're all going to age, but for those who face more economic and social adversities, the process is hastened and intensified. And that's the theme of a book I did a few years ago. It's not Aging in America, but it's another one. And it's called Golden Years. And in there, kind of the main point I argue is that old age intensifies the indignities of economic disadvantage, just as economic disadvantage amplifies the indignities of aging. There are things that will happen to all of our bodies, but they're intensified in a pressure cooker, right, for those who have greater economic adversity. And likewise, we know poverty can kill people and can be really harmful, but it's more harmful for those who have biological factors related to aging. And so I'll walk you through a couple of examples here just to illustrate these points. And pictures are always much more fun than charts, so we're going to move into some pictures now. So we said earlier, we're all going to have things happen to us. Our eyesight is going to get worse, our immune function is going to diminish with age, and in fact, we all are going to look older, right? And when we look older, that makes us vulnerable to ageism, right? If someone's going to say an ageist joke or say something rude, they say it to someone who looks older. Now, all of those biological universals are amplified for those who face economic disadvantage. So for instance, we're all going to have worse eyes and hearing with age for the most part, but for those of us who can afford the adaptations, it has less of a bearing on our life. And all older adults do, in fact, get Medicare Part A. But that doesn't cover a lot of the things that people need to be able to manage those declines. So for instance, things like eyeglasses, assistive devices, walkers, dental care, that you have to pay extra, in short. And so for those who can't necessarily afford Medicare Part B or supplemental insurances, that decline in sight or vision, for instance, is going to have a much harsher toll on their daily interactions than it is for those of us who can afford the eyeglasses or hearing aids or what have you. Another example, compromised immune systems, right? As you get older, you're more vulnerable to colds and flu and whatnot. But then think about the social factors that put one at risk of kind of exposure to germs and whatnot. So we all are vulnerable as we get older, but think about older adults who are from communities where they're raising their grandchildren. We know that communities that have been struck with things like death to young adults, opioid addiction, incarceration, they're taking the parent generation out of the equation and leaving grandma to raise a young child, right? Grandmas are stepping into communities that have faced adversity to care for that child. But what happens when the 5-year-old comes home from kindergarten with germs, as you often see as a young mom? It's fine when you're a young mom, but if you're a 75-year-old grandmother, again, another way that social is intersecting with the biological. And then just one other biological universal, as much as we don't like to admit it, as we get older, we all look older, right? Looking old elicits ageism. It elicits discrimination in the labor market. But it's more so for those who can't actually afford the means to look younger, right? Paying to fix one's teeth, paying to color one's hair, and having a job that doesn't take a toll on your body. If you work a hard job, you're kind of hunched over, you face a lot of adversity. So people actually look older at younger ages when they face economic adversities, which again just kind of draws in more ageism from the larger world. So this is kind of one example about how the biology that happens to all of us plays out in its consequences worse for some people rather than others. Now we're going to kind of flip that argument. We know that poverty is, in all its forms, and the adversities that go with economic precarity, take a toll on health, right? That's a universal. But some of the strains, if you think about some of the strains that people face in daily life when they're living in lower income communities, all those challenges are worse when you have an aging body. So we're going to just flip that prior argument on its head. So if you live in a neighborhood that's under-resourced, you might have cracked sidewalks, right? You see this in some neighborhoods. Walking in a cracked sidewalk and falling down is a nuisance, and it's embarrassing if you're 25. What happens if you fall on that same cracked sidewalk when you're 85, right? Falls are the leading cause of ER visits among older adults, and once an older adult has a fall, sometimes they don't quite recover, and they have a whole secondary set of health complications that come about. Another example, if you live in a building that you don't have very good air conditioning, you don't have very good heating, whatever that may be, again, it's uncomfortable if you're 50 and you're hot and sweaty because you don't have AC, but when you are an older adult, your capacity to sweat and to thermoregulate diminishes dramatically. Older adults take medications that further dehydrate them. And so there are a whole range of reasons. Living in a hard apartment, miserable when you're 25, living in an overly hot apartment when you're 75 can be lethal. And then just to show one more example, that a community that some of our colleagues here at BU study, incarceration, right? Incarceration is something that is very, very common in the United States, especially for communities of African American men. Incarceration is difficult on minds and bodies. Everybody knows that. It's a lot worse on someone's body, again, if they're 75 years old. Could you imagine sleeping on a very thin, kind of threadbare mattress, standing in line, waiting for medications? That takes even a worse toll. So thinking about, again, that social and biological really creates this context whereby some people are having years that are golden and others are having years in late life that are just very, very challenging, if they are so fortunate even to make it to late life. Now, some of you are thinking, well, what about the role of policy here? Medicare. Medicare is a wonderful program. Medicare and Social Security, some of the most influential social programs in the 20th century. But they're not perfect, right? Because nothing in this world is perfect. So Medicare, again, that health insurance that all older adults get, is essential, but it's not a panacea. For some people, it's too little, too late, right? Imagine if you've had kind of a hardscrabble life, you have a physical labor job, you have onset of health problems at 45. Getting that insurance at 65 may be too little, too late. And partly because Aging problems come on earlier when people live under stressful contexts, whether it's prolonged exposure to racism. There's a whole literature by a woman named Arlene Geronimus, exposure to racism speeds up aging, but even prolonged heat exposure. There was a new study that came out last summer that, again, the longer in your early years you're exposed to extreme heat, that hastens aging as well. So all the symptoms that I just talked about that happen when we're older come on earlier for those who have faced more adversity. Medicaid can step in, right? Medicaid is that health insurance for lower income people. But if you know anybody on Medicaid, the first thing they'll tell you is no one will take my insurance. Or the one place that does take my insurance has a 3-year wait list. And again, for doctors, if the reimbursement that comes along with that is very low, right? It's not a fiscally sound decision for them. So you can see these kind of counterbalancing pressures. And again, as I just mentioned, that Medicare coverage is not comprehensive. So that just gives you a sense about thinking about health and thinking about longevity. It's not just biology, it's also these social policy inequality factors. So we're going to transition slightly to a new topic now. We're talking about very structural things that in your daily life, people don't really think too much about policy. They don't think about macro social factors. But as we get older, one thing is really, really important to us. And it's actually really important to younger people as well. And that's social relationships. And I want to make sure we talk about a lot of the good in older adults' lives and all of our lives, but to also talk about some of the challenges that social relationships can pose for older adults. So here, relationships, whether it is with a spouse, a partner, a child, a grandchild, those social ties we have are absolutely critical to our well-being. And this is a major issue. Some of you might know that the former Surgeon General, that was his big area. He said loneliness and social isolation poses a major public health threat, and especially so for older adults. Right, so we're going to talk a bit now, not we, me, just me, there's no one else up here. I shall talk about social relationships and well-being. And this is one of my areas of research, and I've written just a bunch of papers on them, but I'll just give kind of a high-level summary of a couple little nuggets that I thought might be more interesting rather than less interesting for you all to hear about. In our social ties, again, which encompasses things like our marital status or the quality of our social ties, these matter for pretty much every outcome you can think of in one's life. Economic security, quality of end-of-life care, meaning do you have a good death, one that is peaceful, or do you have one that you receive care that you don't want, and it's conflictual and very distressing for the whole family. And then the management of health problems. So the ones in boldface are the ones that I will walk through today. And then the others we can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. But I think increasingly people recognize that social isolation is a major health issue for older adults. And so here's just one example of groups in Massachusetts stepping up, really trying to meet the needs of those older adults growing alone. And there's this name for them in the literature, which I also don't like, called elder orphans. You might have seen the literature on elder orphans. These are people without a spouse or siblings or children. And those are statistically pretty rare. But there are other ways of either being alone or reconfiguring relationships in a way that's just different than what happened historically. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. The family lives of older adults have changed. And not necessarily for the worse, right? But their family lives are changing in such a way that some of our policies haven't quite kept up. And so the whole notion, remember those people at the beginning, the two married couples, one was dancing, one was on a yacht? Older adults are far less likely today to be married to their lifelong spouse than they were 30, 40 years ago. And kind of our policies in our world needs to kind of get up to speed with that to accommodate those new relationships or different types of relationships that people might form. So this is something I like to write about, and this is probably the only thing I write about that the media wants to talk about, as for a moment you'll see. We're obsessed with The Golden Bachelor, and yes, I was watching it Wednesday when I should have been editing my slides. But we know that older adults' lives are more diverse than ever. And why are shows like this so popular? Right? If you watch this show, it's kind of a silly show, but it's a man who's looking to find a new spouse or partner. And all the women on the show are either never married or divorced, or multiply divorced, widowed, or multiply widowed. This is suggesting there's kind of a market out there. There's an interest in people who are reaching their 60s or 70s who are not with their same lifelong spouse. This is something that people like to watch on television, but demographers have demonstrated this is a very large and growing population, right? We used to say the one life, one relationship model. The ship has kind of sailed, right? Many people are fortunate enough to have had that relationship. Others are fortunate enough to figure out it wasn't working and to find something new. But again, our world doesn't necessarily have policies that can meet the needs of people in these newly reconfigured relationships, as you'll see in a couple of slides. So when I'm talking about older adults' family lives being different than in the past, here are just a couple little snippets that family demographers love to generate. We love statistics. So rates of gray divorce in particular have just increased at a tremendous pace over the past 2 decades. And in fact, divorce rates have increased only among those age 50 plus, meaning you end your marriage at age 50 plus, not that you divorce at 30 and then you're still divorced at 50. So gray divorce is something that has really increased in prevalence for a lot of reasons. Some of the old reasons that apply to younger people, women's economic independence, that's always been the main explanation. You can afford to leave someone. The other is someone wakes up at 50, they look at their spouse, they know they're going to be living another 35 years, and you really want to spend the next 35 years with this person? Perhaps not. And so people are feeling kind of encumbered to find the happiness with a new partner. Also, the notion that you stay together for the kids, that's something that's diminished over time. So we have more people doing gray divorce. Another thing that we have is rates of singlehood or never married status, meaning those who have never married or been in a permanent partnership. It's been increasing across generations. Right now, it's about 9 to 10% of those who have never married and who are not with a co-residential partner, so kind of on their own. Rates of childlessness are also fairly high. Again, you can see some of those increases there. And it's not just the unmarried people. Rising numbers of married persons or partnered persons are staying childless. And then some people are just eschewing marriage altogether and they're cohabiting for life. And then within that cohabitation, there's a whole other group of older adults that are called LATs. Does anybody know what a LAT is? L-A-T? It's living apart together. So you're essentially going steady, but you have your own home. And women tend to want that more than men because women want someone to go out with and the men want someone to come home to, is what kind of the standard characterization is. But these are very enduring relationships that are very close, but they don't particularly have legal status, right? And so that can be an issue when it comes to things like end-of-life decision making. But kind of the takeaway of all of this here is that Gen X's and boomers are, as they age, more either living alone or they're living in some kind of relationship that wasn't the kind of relationship that social policies were designed for 50 years ago. And they might be relationships that their children in some cases don't even necessarily understand. So we need to figure out what are the impacts of all these family changes. Some are good, some are bad, and it has less to do actually with the relationship, but it has to do with, again, the structural factors that just make it easier to be married, right? We live in a world that kind of emphasizes marriage still. And for those who aren't married, you'll see that there are some negative consequences due to, again, supports not being where they need to be. So here I'll just walk through a couple of papers and I'll keep it, again, very high level. I'm not going to talk about data sets or variables or statistics, but if anybody wants to talk about that later, I am thrilled. I will talk about coding. It gets me very psyched to talk about coding data. But for now, we're just going to look at a couple of recent publications that have come out, a couple grant-funded projects here. But I also want to point out, as Stan mentioned earlier, our undergrads at BU are getting amazing research experience, and so are our graduate students. So here are our 2 very recent PhD students who are RAs on these projects. Lei Ping is now a postdoc at Vanderbilt, and Kristen's a new assistant professor at Hood, is having a baby really soon, yay. So it's really great to see their lives after they graduate, but it's also wonderful to have their statistical expertise as we work through some of these papers. So what this collection of papers examines is economic inequality on the basis of marital status among older adults. We know there's a ton of that among younger people. We know that among young working age people, divorced women are in very dire economic straits. They divorce, in most cases they don't get their alimony or child support, and then it's hard for them to go back to work full time because they're raising children. So there are a whole range of factors why the younger working age people have very dramatic economic disparities on the basis of marital status. But for older adults, we too do as well. And I think some people find that puzzling because, like, well, we have Social Security, right? Doesn't Social Security kind of lift all boats? Well, Social Security, again, is an amazing social policy. It does lift all boats. But I think it's actually little known fact that the benefits are tied to marital status in such a way that disadvantages marital statuses that are essentially kind of newer or anything outside of marriage for the most part. And so I'll give kind of really quick primer on this. But if some of you know, when you're retirement age, you can get your own work or Social Security benefit, or if you're married, your spouses, 100% of your spouses. If you're widowed, you can choose either one based on your own work or 100% of your late spouse, right? Because you were married for a long time, you were a wife, you supported your husband, now he's dead, you get 100% of that. But if you're divorced, you get half of your spouse's income. It's for your woman who doesn't have enough income to draw from your own benefits. If you had a marriage that was less than 10 years, no entitlement to the spouse's benefits. Your benefit is cut down, as you can see in that chart, if you draw your widowhood benefit at a younger age as opposed to an older age. So there are these lot of rules, lots and lots of rules. It's a very long website. But the rules disproportionately affect those who also come from backgrounds of economic adversity. We know that marriage has become an institution of economic privilege, and a new study just came out on that. People with more money tend to be more likely to marry. We know that economic precarity is a risk factor for divorce. So if you're divorced and you already have some economic precarity, you're also hurt by these rules, right? Especially if you're a woman, you exit the labor force, your earnings aren't so hot, so you're not going to draw your own worker benefit, then you rely on your spouses, and then you get half, kind of, if you're lucky to have stayed married long enough. And so these are some minutia rules that are in Social Security. And again, you think about the history of Social Security, remember that chart? It was developed during a time period when people were married for life. So this is, again, a way that policy might lag behind reality. So to really dig into this question, these wonderful grad students and I used a data set called the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study. And this is a really cool survey that interviewed every high school senior in the state of Wisconsin in 1957 and followed them forward through that. And this one chart took about 2 years of coding, complete marital histories, really to know every marriage that someone has. And so what we did, we calculated on the basis of marital history one's risk of poverty, and trying to come up with marital statuses, not just married, divorced, etc., but keying them to those Social Security rules. Were you widowed prematurely, meaning young, and were you married long enough to get your the divorce benefit? And so there were a couple things going on there. If this was my class, I'd ask students, what do you see? Tell me what's happening in that chart here. But as you can see, a couple things should pop out at you. One, the dotted line, which is women, is always higher, for the most part, except one exception, than the solid line. In pretty much every marital category, women have much higher rates of poverty than men, right? And for divorced women and widowed women, it is dramatically higher, right? And we expected that the women who had the short-term marriage over there, divorced, longest marriage 10 years or less, we thought they'd do worse, but it's actually women with the longest marriages. And we think, why is that? You know, women who invested in their marriages, who maybe were caregivers and then divorced, that investment that they had in their marriage and the time they took away from the labor force, they're not receiving back. They're not receiving back through the benefits. So there's something about traditional gender roles that maybe help women in the older cohorts when they stay married, but not when they divorce. So again, that gets us thinking again, is it divorced people are poor, something about being divorced? Well, no, there's something about the structure of their lives that elevate that risk of poverty for those who ended their marriages, specifically the women people whose marriages ended. One other thing that's really interesting here, never married people. That is the one age group where you see no gender gap. And this is something we wrestled with an awful lot. Why are never married men have such high rates of poverty? And we were thinking, we threw every possible control we could think of in that study. Is it heterosexism with these men in same-sex unions who couldn't marry? Was it workplace issues? Was it singleism, right? We know there's discrimination against never married people. And we honestly can't quite figure it out in this study. But the good news is, with some co-investigators at Vanderbilt, we just got a big NIH grant to launch the first ever national survey of older never married adults. Mind you, it's a pilot study. Hopefully we'll get more money to do a full survey. But we're going in the field now when we have questions of never married people about discrimination and about the stressors that they faced in life and about having no economies of scale. You're paying 100% of everything and trying to figure out ways that this might factor in. So I think this is kind of a nice example of classic social science work. We do the best we can. We do not figure it out, and then we try to find money so we can and go launch a new study to dig into this. But again, economic factors very much stratified by families, right? And if we don't kind of update some of our rules about benefits, it will continue to disadvantage those who are from marital statuses that maybe are totally common today, but were not totally common back in the 70s and even beforehand, right, when Social Security was being built and refined. Right, so now just go through 2 more topics before our 4 o'clock hard stop, right? And so we've been talking about economic factors, but economic indicators are just one indicator of well-being. And so we're going to just pivot now to a new topic, another indicator of well-being, which is something that people don't like to think about. I think about it all the time because this is one of my research areas, but it's end of life. How do we die? And that's something, that's a topic, a heady topic that we could talk about later. But most people want a good death. A good death is one where you have no physical symptoms. You are at peace. Your preferences for healthcare are met. You get the kind of treatments that you want or don't want. And I don't like this quote here. People, you know, I don't know, angst-ridden people like to say, we're born alone, we die alone. No, no one dies alone. It's a rare person who dies alone. Most people actually die in the context of family relationships and have their families with them as they make really difficult decisions. And this is something I suspect many of you have gone through, right? Figuring out, do we give mom a feeding tube? Do we move them to hospice? I mean, these are issues that are very, very difficult. And families are an integral part of end-of-life decisions, even though people who are morose like to say, oh, we all die alone. It's actually pretty rare. And so that kind of launched this project that I did with a wonderful postdoc here, also at BU, Kafiyat Mahmood. And this paper just actually came out earlier this week. We were interested in how things like marital status and having children and having friends, does that affect the quality of your death, right? And so some of you might be thinking, how do you study quality of death? You can't ask the person, they're already dead. Well, if you're thinking that, you are in fact correct, but we do something called proxy interviews. This is a data set called NHATS. It's a survey of older adults. It really tracks them over long time periods. So we know a lot about them, education, income, marital status. And then when they die, an in-depth interview is done 6 to 12 months later with a close caregiver, someone who fills out the surveys, and they're called the proxy. And so we look at their impressions of what the death was like. So again, all kinds of statistical details we can talk about if anybody is so inclined. But here, this is unadjusted. It looks the same if we control for every other possible risk factor. There are a couple outcomes here. One is, was the patient and the family, were they kept informed about the patient condition, right? Because we know being in the dark is something that's very distressing. Were their personal care needs met? Were they kept clean? Were they kind of listened to? Were their needs met? Were they treated with respect? And then finally here, how would you rate their overall quality of care? So, and there were a bunch of different measures. These are just ones I'm showing because they are kind of intuitive here. And so what do we find? Well, for the most part, the good thing is most people actually do have a pretty good quality of death here. As you can see, those levels are somewhere in the neighborhood of 80%. Then it goes down a little bit over here for overall quality. But you will notice that there's one bar slightly lower than the others consistently, the green bar, right? And this we tested to see, is it different for men versus women? And it wasn't, which was kind of surprising. But so people who are divorced report, or at least their proxies report, that they were less informed, personal care needs met at a slightly lower rate, and then treated with respect, slightly lower rate, and then overall quality of care. And this is something we're kind of thinking about, like, why could that be? And we have a couple explanations for it. One is that, you know, divorce can disrupt social ties in some cases, and so they might objectively have fewer people who can step up to advocate for them. Right? At the end of life, when someone dies, they need someone in their court to advocate for them, to support them, to make sure that their needs are met. And divorced people often do have stepchildren, and even though this is a finding a lot of us don't necessarily like, the data show that stepchildren tend to be less engaged and advocate less for the older adult. Oftentimes it's just because their relationship is of shorter duration. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It just means that they know less about this individual. Sometimes divorce, again, given the contentious state that often happens when divorces proceed, there could be strained relationships. Sometimes when there's a divorce, one person gets the friend, one spouse gets the friend, the other spouse does not get the friend. So that's yet another source of social support and advocacy at the end of life that might go away. And then one other explanation that is a structural explanation. Divorced people have lower rates of hospice care. Hospice care is just critical to achieving a good death. It focuses on pain relief, palliation, rather than treating. There are some hospices, and this wasn't my study, it was someone else's, but some hospices in the US will not accept a patient unless they have a co-residential caregiver. And kind of makes sense because having a co-residential caregiver is part of the hospice philosophy. But again, this is a case whereby someone who is divorced probably not going to have a spouse with them. So just thinking about ways that some of these policies around the edges can be kind of brought in line with the way families are going today. This is something we just need to think about. Care providers need to think about this because we have ever-rising numbers of divorced people, right? And some of them might repartner, but they might not necessarily remarry. So again, this is an issue that we need to think about. And marital status isn't the thing that makes one's life golden or not, but it's the thing that might not align with the policies that are made for past generations. So let's see, I think I just have one last example here. So we've been talking about marital structure now, kind of our last example to kind of wrap things up in the last 7 minutes here. Is marriage the silver bullet for older adults? Is marriage the key, or a partnership, a cohabitation partnership? Is this the key to health and happiness? It can be, but not necessarily, right? Relationships can be difficult at any age, but think about when one person has intense healthcare needs, or you have new issues to deal with, like do we put mom in a nursing home? Do we not put her in a nursing home? Or, there's interesting research that wives are more likely than husbands on average to, it's not my word, to kind of nag when one becomes unhealthy, because it's historically women are socialized to be the caregiver. And if the husband here is like, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to hear any more advice about taking care of myself, this can lead to marital strain. So this is another area of interest I have about what are the roles of relationships? Are there some relationships that can help people navigate the challenges of later life better than others? Right. Well, here are some papers that I've done with, they're not students, so their pictures don't get up here. But these are just a bunch of papers about this question. What are the role of our relationships, not just parents, but children, when it comes to managing illness? So especially in the case of illness impairment, relationships can be a double-edged sword. And I'll just walk you through a couple kind of quick slides here before we transition into the Q&A. So relationships matter at all times, but most of the stress and coping research shows that social support matters most when you're in a downtime. So social support, it's not going to make your life that much happier if you're already happy and your life is good. Social support is most powerful when we encounter some stressor. And a very common stressor of old age is disability status, right? And this isn't necessarily being confined to a wheelchair, but it's things like seeing problems, hearing problems. You need a little bit more help with meal preparation, getting dressed, etc. And so as you can see, as we get older, that red bar proportion with a disability increases. So these folks have to navigate a marriage with bodies that are different, with hearing that is different, right? And so what does that look like? So I'll give just 2 quick slides just because they're interesting and counterintuitive. So you want to be surprised at this point because you've been sitting a long time and you're probably getting bored. So here, this is a finding that we thought it was a fake finding. Like we reanalyzed our data like 20 times, but now we actually buy it. So here, I'll walk through what's happening. Here, we stratify our sample of older adults based on the severity of their disability, meaning how much help they need kind of getting around their day. Severity quartile 4 are those with the greatest severe disability, who need the most help. We have men and we have women. So you might notice here we have 3 lines that are all going down. For those 3 lines, the more support you get, the less frustrated you are. That makes sense. If you're a woman, it doesn't matter about your health. If you're a man who's healthy, the more support you get, the less frustrated you are on a daily basis. But we do have this one line here that's gray that's going the reverse of all of them. That bar is men who have high levels of impairment, and the more their wives support them, the more frustrated they are. And so we think, again, that maybe reflects the fact that as men, especially older generations of men, as their bodies start to change a bit, right, and they might feel that their autonomy is threatened, that support that's so well-intentioned might just lead to more frustration. So again, that's another larger lesson we have here when we think about aging, that we have to meet people where they are and deliver them the kind of support they need. And then here, the other flip side here is for married women with health problems, the more strain in their relationship, and for older adults, strain isn't, abuse, it's more like we argue, we have disagreements. For women who have health problems, the more strain they report, like family squabbles, the happier they appear to be. And we think actually its arguments aren't necessarily bad. They're a way of staying engaged, a way of staying relevant, about being part of the family. And so there might be a case whereby when people's bodies start to work less well than they did, any form of engagement might be protective and might make them feel better. So those are just kind of a couple examples of ways that relationships might play out to make our lives more or less golden moving forward. I think I'll skip that. Friends play a great role. If someone's not married, I'm not going to walk you through this whole slide there, but if you're an unmarried person and you have physical health problems, getting support from a friend really can be helpful. So that's kind of a talk for a later day. So I've talked a bit about policy here. And just to wrap up here, there are all kinds of things we can do. We can think about refining our policies, as I referenced earlier. That's just kind of a wrap-up slide. We can do more to invest in public-private initiatives, right? There are a lot of public-private initiatives that are designed to keep older adults engaged through things like volunteering, Meals on Wheels that help them to stay socially engaged, even if they're living on their own. AARP and AmeriCorps have volunteering programs for older adults that actually give a stipend. So I think, although we've talked a lot about Social Security and Medicare, there are other ways to provide supports for older adults so that they can stay engaged in full, rich lives and have meaningful social ties and have a sense of purpose. But just to end on one note, I think any talk of aging has to conclude with recognizing the contributions of older persons in speaking up against ageism, right? I've talked a little bit about ageism, but this is something that we know is rampant. It can be anything as common as elder speak, a doctor saying to an 80-year-old patient, "How are we today, honey, young lady?" This infantilizing talk that you sometimes hear in clinical encounters, all the way up to jokes and hashtags like "OK Boomer." These are things that are not going away, even though the number of older adults is getting larger and we would assume more power. So anybody who feels strongly about this, I put a couple links up here to organizations that explicitly are there to fight ageism. They have resources, they have tools for calling it out when you see it. And then just recognizing, as I often tell students who think older adults are all conservative or they're all set in their ways, I'm like, who do you think started Earth Day? Who was the first one out there fighting the power? Here are these older people today. Do you know where that was? It was in front of Stan's building, right in front of CIS in 1972. This was a cohort of BU students. So again, this recognition that people who were activists back 50 years ago still have that spark and still have that power to implement change and to change the opinions of folks who maybe are less well-informed or welcoming of older adults. But I think it can't rest just with the older adults themselves. Everyone younger needs to kind of call out ageist treatment when they see it, because it happens across all professions. So I will leave it there. It's 4 o'clock, and we're going to have a nice conversation. So thank you so much for listening.
Professor, brilliant lecture. Thank you. So we'll take questions now. You can come up to the microphone if you have a question. I'm going to ask the first question.
Yes.
You've become a real leader in aging. What got you interested in aging?
That's a good question. And oftentimes, for most academics, what gets you interested in something is actually a combination of kind of happenstance and personal background. At one level, when I was recruited to go to graduate school, I was brought on a project, the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study, and the person running it said, well, if you come to grad school, you can work with me on this survey that's tracking people we've been tracking for 50 years. We're going to get more data, and we can learn about aging. And I was like, well, absolutely. And I think I always had this kind of lingering interest in aging. And as I mentioned to you, one of my very first jobs when I was 13 years old, I was a paper girl, and I delivered the Providence Journal to the low-income senior housing apartment in my town, Cranston, Rhode Island. And I just loved doing that. And I actually had all these observations when I was a paper girl there, how if I was like 10 minutes late bringing the newspaper because I had like band rehearsal, they were all waiting in the lobby for me, like, where's my newspaper? And I would tell my mother, like, oh, the paper girl was late, I didn't have the newspaper. And she's like, well, they don't have that much to do all day. Like, they're so eager to see you and to bring the paper. And I noticed all these things. There were 100 women and 3 men. I still remember them, 2 Mr. Cohens and 1 Mr. Swanson. And this was like 40 years ago. And so I didn't have the term heterogeneity in aging back then, because that would have made me very unpopular as a junior high student. But I just loved these people and their stories and the way they would interact. And so then years later, when I had this opportunity, I kind of ran with it. And then once you start doing research, every question leads to a new question. And that's what makes our job just so wonderful, right? It's just kind of ever generating.
Right. I had a paper too.
Yes.
Are there any questions? Anybody with a question? Yeah, please come up to the microphone. Thank you.
Talk about controversy. In philosophy, my question is kind of twofold, compared, like how we compare to other countries, especially Asian countries, but specifically, philosophically, like we don't have a choice to be here, right? Like when we're born, we don't really have a choice to be here. So why wouldn't we have a choice to choose how we die? Like, so this goes on to like self-elected euthanasia, and especially for someone like me who would be single and I'm probably gonna die alone. Can I choose like when I end that versus allowing, I don't know, hospice to deny me care or something like that? And then two, how that's comparing to other policies in other countries. Like France had a very controversial ruling on that, and you know, Asian countries they're kind of malleable about that. So I'm just curious what your take is, or what research you've seen, or policy that's changing around that philosophy.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I definitely talk about in my death and dying class. And I personally am absolutely an advocate for medical aid in dying, which is the new word for what we used to call physician-assisted suicide. And a couple of states have physician-assisted. Oh my God, I shut my ringer off. Sorry. Okay. That wasn't a ploy to deflect your hard question. Stop. Okay. Yes. There are a number of states that have this, and there are very strict rules about it. So you can't just request the medication to end your life. You need 2 doctors to ascertain that you in fact have a terminal illness and that you're not depressed, meaning you're not making a decision that's motivated by emotion. And you need a couple of witnesses who are not family members. And on top of that, after you make the request for those meds to curtail your life, there's a waiting period. And interestingly, in Oregon, which is the only state where they actually have data, most people who request the meds don't actually take them, which is just very interesting. And then the other thing that the data show, which I think you'll find really interesting, opponents to this say, well, it's slippery slope. How do we know it's just not old people with disability, you know, being pushed off the life raft? When you look at the data, it's actually relatively young, white, educated people who are actually requesting the meds, at least in Oregon, which is the one state where there's really good data. It goes to ballot in different states. It's been up in Massachusetts twice, it's been up in New Jersey, and it keeps getting shot down, whether at the state legislator level or even at the voting level. And in Michigan, when I was living there, it went to ballot. I voted for it. Ann Arbor was the only city that went for it. So I think in the United States, given our holdover of religion, that's maybe one of the reasons. I think maybe this kind of blind optimism, people will say, well, tomorrow you could get a cure. You could be better tomorrow, and you'll regret it. So I think we actually have a long wait in the United States before we actually legalize medical aid in dying. But there are other places that are models, like Switzerland is often held up as a model. And you know, I think this notion of respecting the autonomy of people, I think the one place where it gets sticky is everywhere they want to make sure that you are indeed diagnosed as terminally ill if your illness runs its typical course, and that diagnosis is approved by or kind of okayed by 2 doctors, because you don't want someone just walking in off the street who's suicidal. So probably a long answer, but I think it's such an important issue, and we will be grappling with this increasingly, I think, through the decades.
Any other questions? Yes, please, come on up.
I noticed you asked, or you were talking about the golden age in the first half of the lecture. I was just wondering, like, why is it called the golden age? Because as we age, we're able to move less, and we might suffer from like serious diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia. So like, why is it called the golden age?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know, maybe it goes back to the old tradition of like the golden anniversary or the silver anniversary. I think it was kind of a marketing construct, in part because marketers know that older adults in some cases have actually disposable income, and if you can sell something that sounds really nice, they may buy it. There's a whole literature called the longevity economy. It's like, look, older adults have all this money, let's market to them. But interestingly, did some radio show a couple weeks ago, a call-in show, which is always great fun. And this was the topic, like, what do you, older people, like to be called? Do you like to be called golden agers? And to a one, they're like, hell no, golden agers, like, that's lame. They're like older adults. Like, they don't want silver, fox, or any of that kind of stuff. They just want to call it what you call it. So that's what my sense is, although I might have to Google that on the train ride home tonight, why it is called golden years. And for my book, in my defense, I called it golden years question mark, with a really intentional question mark to underscore the fact that it's not always golden, but for some it can be. And I guess that's one thing we just want to leave on the floor. For some people, their work lives are kind of drudgery, right? Being retired, not necessarily so bad. It gives people a time to pursue their goals. Another is that when people get older, they tend to care less what people think. There's this phrase, gray hair don't care, especially for women. So when they're 65, they can kind of do whatever the heck they want and don't need to worry about catering to everybody else's needs. So there are indeed positive aspects of aging, but absolutely, as you point out, physical health problems and for some economic problems absolutely go with that process.
Any other questions? Yes, please. Can you use the microphone? Thanks. Yep.
Dr. Carr, I'd like to ask you about a couple of things that I've read to see if I have my facts right, but also ask you to comment. I read in an AARP publication that the fastest growing group of newly homeless people in America are people over 65. Yeah. Is that correct?
I think it probably is. I don't know if it's the most rapidly growing, but it is a major, major problem.
The other thing I want to ask you about is there have been some recent studies of what people have in their retirement accounts at various ages. And as pensions have gone away and people have to take responsibility themselves for funding their own retirement, something along the lines of 40 to 45% of all Americans have absolutely nothing in a retirement account. And those who do have money in retirement accounts, the median amounts at the various age groups are scary. They're very low. Yeah. Can you speak to what that means for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the homeless point, that's, I think, one of the most devastating. The wait list to get into low-income housing for older adults, it's really, really long. We have people who can't afford their housing. We have veterans, for instance. We have substance users. So it's just kind of devastating, the numbers of older adults. And again, their bodies are not designed at that point to withstand those elements. So again, a major issue that I think we need to do something about. On the pension side, you're absolutely right that over the past 50 years or so, there's been a transition in the kinds of pensions people get. There's a transition from defined contribution to defined benefit. So in the days of yore, people would say they worked on the assembly line at Ford, they all got their pensions, boom, 50 years and out. Today, you're lucky to have a pension. Most white-collar jobs have pensions. Blue-collar workers don't. Gig workers, like the young people today, don't. And what makes these two plans different is in the old days, the employer would put a lot in. Today, you choose what to put in, right? We all choose how much goes into our pension. If you're living check to check, are you going to sock away a bunch of money in your pension? No. If you don't know how to invest, you're not going to put it in that account. If the interest rates are volatile, you might put some money in, but it's all going to not rise in the way you would like. And so this pension crisis really is, I think, a very big deal, and it's going to get worse for the younger cohorts, millennials who have gig jobs. They don't have pensions at all. And so there are a lot of models. Again, Europe always does better. Sweden's a good one. That's one where the employers and the workers automatically opt in, right? And that's rather than making it elective. But I think this is a major issue. And again, Social Security does a lot of good, but it's certainly not going to sustain people in the way they need to be.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Thank you. I'm really interested in your research, and I'm 64, and I never thought I would get this old. I was eternally youthful, and now it's happened. I'm still working. I plan to work. Two points I wanted to make, and I wanted your opinion on it. One, I lived up here for 8 years, and then I lived in D.C. for 20, and there's a whole group of people. They're all singletons. They refuse to marry. The men won't commit. The women, chase them. It's just a thing. And I actually have a whole group of girlfriends my age. One's a lawyer. One's a professional. I mean, I have an MBA from here. We're all professionals. I'm divorced. They never married. We are all aging together, and we have not married. And so it's a thing. And I understand in big cities, This has happened for a whole generation of women. And I came of age, I started college in 1979. Received the benefit of the Women's Liberation Unit, right? And I mean, I'm not dissing that. I'm an engineer. I mean, I've had a good career, but I wondered if you had done any research on that, about this cohort, this group. Secondary, the reason why my hair looks like this is I'm a cancer survivor. I'm okay, I'm in remission, but I almost left the world about 3 years ago. I'm afraid to retire because of the health care. So I'm like working away. I plan to work till I drop. If you can comment on that too, because I do think there are like 18 million cancer survivors, and it can I think it's the leading cause of bankruptcies in the US. So thank you. Thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you for both of those. I'm so glad to hear that you're doing better. Yes, medical debt is just astronomical in this country compared to other parts of the world, and cancer kind of leads that pack there, and it really is appalling, and I think there are policies going in and out that aren't helping that cause at all. And I don't know what the solutions are. I think that's such a big issue. Is it lying with the insurers? Is it with the hospitals? Is it, the R&D for medications? But in other parts of the world, they don't have the same medical debt, and the rates of cancer aren't that different in other wealthy, Western nations. And so, absolutely, it's a huge issue. Medical debt is one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States for people who are kind of midlife and older, and that's something from which people can rarely recover. And that I don't have a good policy solution, but I very much wish we did, because it's appalling that paying for health care, whether it's a child or one's own, literally bankrupts families and contributes to things like homelessness, like we had just talked about. So hopefully, if there's any undergrads in the world who are going into policymaking, please fix that. And then on your first point, I have lots of friends in the same predicament. I have a friend who's a never married woman. She's my age. She's already picked out like the long-term care place that has like all the cool people and the fun things to do, so she'll have that community. And you do hear kind of anecdotally, people talk all the time. They want the Golden Girls experience of being in a house with other women, in particular because older populations skew female. And you do see that if you look at people who have never married, women on average do have better outcomes than men, like you saw on that chart, in part because they have these communities of friends, and they've learned they have to be proactive. They've learned they're not going to rely on their spouse, and so they form their friendships. And that's the paper I went through really quickly there. I think cities are very good about this. Rural areas are really hard, but there are programs like The Villages that you might have heard about, which is a fantastic program. Anyone who's interested in this, it's a way to allow people to age in place, meaning you grow old in your own home, and you all pay a small fee, and then you and all your people in your community, like you might cook dinner for them, or you might fix your computer and someone might cook dinner for you. And so it's a way that people rely on each other in a way that allows them to lead from a position of strength. And so these Villages programs, I think, are really a fantastic way to go. But absolutely, there are a lot of studies of never married women and women on their own who just find their own communities. And in many ways, aging is less bad for them. I have another paper I didn't show. Unmarried women or never married women have really high rates of things like advanced care planning and estate planning. Why? They know they have to do it themselves, and so they do, and they are much more prepared. So I think even people who don't follow the standard path of married and children are actually figuring out their way really very well, very strategically, like it sounds like your community of friends are doing. Hello.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor. I loved all the data, especially all the economic data. I myself is a Gen Xer, just turned 55, so retirement is very heavily on my mind. I recall as a teenager watching the Golden Girls talk about, particular cohorts. I wonder what the data is showing about people who choose to cohabitate, who have no familiar relation and no legal status to each other, but are choosing to cohabitate. And I ask the question because I think of gays and lesbians. I'm seeing now in my community, a lot of people who have no relation to each other are cohabitating and pulling funds together to sort of make a semblance of a life.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that there is data on that. The census gets who is in your household. Actually, I could figure this out. They ask, according to the census, who's in your household and what is their relationship to you. The tricky thing is, roommate or friend You can't quite figure out what their relationship is, but I think there is a way to actually document these data. And I think you're absolutely right. This is a very strategic way to go, right? It's a source of social support. It's a kind of camaraderie, but also economies of scale. And as tedious as that sounds, maintaining 2 households and 2 internet connections and 2 gallons of milk is twice as much, right, unless you can share it. And so I think people recognizing economies of scale and the need for one another and the need for connection absolutely is the way to go. And there's more writing about this in the UK for whatever reason. They're like, you know, they're houses that they invite people to kind of live together rather than having it come about kind of organically as you're describing. But I think this has got to be the way it goes, right? Housing, especially in urban areas, is too much for anybody to swing on their own. And then that need for connection is absolutely part of that friendship or roommate cohabitation. Great, great idea. Thanks.
May I ask, what is the age of peak happiness or contentment, if there's a difference?
Yeah. That's actually a good question. I drove a paper of that with a student. You know, there's a little bit of a debate. There was this thing called the U-shaped happiness curve that a guy named Blanchflower did, and they actually argue that it's midlife, right? Young people are always angst-ridden all the time, and at the very end, like around 75 plus, it starts to tip to less happy when people have onset of problems. But there's some data that show really it's kind of those midlife years of 40 to 60, when people still have their health for the most part. But then, of course, there's a whole team of people who refute those studies. But the data I've seen is kind of 40 to 60, and that's not just wishful thinking, because I am at that point. Yeah, but for most charts, if you look at depressive symptoms, the worst years are actually 18 to 24, right? When people are still finding their way, especially in the pandemic.
Yes, please. Yep.
So I remember your data point or your graph about like the poverty line and how like it decreased significantly after like, I think like it was Social Security maybe?
So Social Security goes way back to the early 20th century, but the benefits rate, so they would kind of flat for a long time. And then in the 70s, they really increased it to keep up with the cost of living. So that's why the poverty rate went down. It went from being a benefit that was there, that was really paltry, to being a benefit that was a bit better.
Okay, so yeah, I wanted to make a point on that because I hear a lot of like news that Social Security is gonna run out, especially for my generation.
Yeah.
So it kind of feels like we're kind of working for nothing. Like we're not gonna have a fail-safe. As we get older, we're gonna have to rely more on like our savings, and like companies are doing like pensions less and less as well. So, but for a lot of people, they live paycheck to paycheck, so they can't afford to like do savings and stuff like that. So I was like wondering how it would affect all your data points. Let's say you did this study in like 20 years from now, like how would that affect like literally everything you just talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were talking about that last week. That's probably the question I get from reporters more than anything. And I think about that all the time. What will old age look like for aging Gen X and aging millennials? And even though I am the biggest optimist in the world, I think everything is great all the time. In this case, I cannot be optimistic for exactly the reasons you said. The millennials are coming out with high levels of educational debt. The job market is constricting in a lot of professional areas. We know that they have gig jobs that don't provide pensions, for instance. The rates of housing costs have been driven up dramatically, and these changes have been going back to the 80s, right? We've had this widening of the gap between the haves and have-nots, going back to 1980s era tax policies that favor the rich. And so it honestly does look quite bleak for younger people unless we have some major change happen, right? And I think we're going to have not golden years for your generation. I think we're going to have a platinum class, and everybody else, I think it actually looks fairly dire. And I won't be political, but the current political state is not giving me any further optimism in any way. You know, are there any sources of optimism? You know, I think that's really hard. I mean, one is economies and political trends are cyclical. The other is that millennials, which I'm guessing you're probably a millennial or a zillennial. You're Gen Z. Okay, you're young. There are a lot of you. You're a very large cohort. And so if this group of people really votes with their feet and is active, there might be ways to affect change. You know, the debate about the solvency of Social Security has been around for a long time. And like, are the Gen Xers going to have anything, or millennials and Gen Z? You know, the economists have been debating this for a long time, but it's an entitlement program, and people have been paying into it, and they are indeed entitled. It is not a welfare benefit. So hopefully they can figure out something. There are a ton of strategies. Like if you're into this kind of stuff, if you go to the CBO website, the Congressional Budget Office, you'll see all these different policies. And literally a considerable tax increase on that top 1% could really resolve the problems in many ways, right? So there are ways to do this. Means testing is another thing, which is very sticky. You know, like does a gazillionaire need their Social Security? Well, they've been paying into it. So that's an area that, you know, I'm not touching that one. It's very controversial. So it looks bleak, but I think there is always a glimmer of optimism because things can turn around. But something definitely needs to change, right? And the one thing that is happening, and it's time to wrapping up, the age is getting higher and higher. So we all think it's 65. Well, for me, it's 67. For you, it'll probably be 68. So they are pushing it out further and further, which is great if you're a white-collar worker like us who can work till we're 70. Not so great if you're a waitress or you're a construction worker, who pushing it out to 67 means, you know, you have to work when your joints are really falling apart. So lots of big issues in there, and I appreciate your question and your concern, because this is a big issue.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
So technology will play into aging, right, as well?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm expecting a lot of robots helping me when I'm older.
Yeah. The robots are a very big deal. I didn't show you a slide. We have a massive caregiver shortage, right? People who don't have children, with restrictive immigration policy, we just do not have enough people to care for our older adults. And Japan is the oldest country in the world. Robots, like they're investing a lot in the development of robots. And so when we talk about this, you know, this is a common thing. You're going to have robotic caregivers, you know, the robotic stuffed toy, the little stuffed dog that makes people feel loved. But all the survey data show that older adults, they don't want the robot. They want someone actually who's going to hold their hand and kind of engage with them in a meaningful way. So maybe someone out there is making a robot that actually looks kind of like a real person rather than Rosie from the Jetsons. But, you know, something has to change in order to accommodate this. And I'm hoping maybe technologies that allow people, you know, greater strength to do things. But again, a lot of issues that, again, it's not the older people, it's us. It's our job to, again, repair the world so we can accommodate all of us when we get to that age.
There you go.
Exactly. Siri will bring you your dinner. Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. You actually anticipated my question to a large extent. I was interested in that graphic showing the increasing proportions of older adults in the different countries. I was especially struck by the very appalling line for Hong Kong saying that it was going to be 50% very soon. I do know from my experience, having been in Hong Kong for a while, that they rely very heavily on exploiting migrant labor, and I do mean exploiting. And so my question was, is there a different paradigm other than, you know, for all the aging societies, other than continuing to draw people from other countries who may still be reaping a demographic dividend? Other than this, is there a different paradigm going forward?
You know, I hope there is, and I think this is a really big issue. Like in the United States as well, our paid caregivers are overwhelmingly immigrant women of color. And if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Outlook Handbook, the one job over the past 20 years that we need more of than anything else are these CNAs. The mean pay is $35,000 a year. And so this is exploitative work. It takes women of color from other parts of the world away from their own families, right? And now we're not even going to have these women, right, if we continue to have exploitative, restrictive immigration policy. And I think about this a lot. How can we have a fair and just way of providing care for older adults? One is to just raise their wages, right? And to have tracks for promotion among those who are doing long-term care so they're not exploited like you've been seeing in Hong Kong. Another thing that could work in the US that I've seen floated, and I kind of like this one, but we don't have a big supply, is just as there are special immigration visas for nannies and au pairs. You know, a young woman will come to the US from Germany and they'll care for someone's baby and have a nice apartment on the Upper West Side. Why don't we do that for elder care, right? Bring in young European people, or not even European, they can be from Asia, they can be anywhere in the entire world, and give them 2 or 3 years in the United States. Some older people have a spare room in their house who would help with the housing issue and care for them that way. But I think we really need to do more than just say, let's just keep paying immigrants, barely minimum wage to do really literally back-breaking work. And we saw this in the pandemic. They all kind of burnt out. And in the pandemic, some of you might have seen signs around town like, hey, be a CNA for $30 an hour because they were so desperate. Well, why not keep that, right? It might not be feasible, but there have been moments when they have been properly compensated for the back-breaking work that they do. So I absolutely appreciate that concern.
Thank you again. Thank you for all your scholarship and leadership in this area, and I love the book.
Thank you.
So thank you for the thought-provoking lecture and Q&A. It's nice to have so many questions. I'm sure there are others that could have been asked and may be asked afterwards. Professor Carr, thank you. And Scott, thank you for serving as moderator. And a big thank you to Jerry Gitner again and his family. We are so fortunate to have your support for this endowed lecture. The next lecture in the Arts and Sciences series will be on Thursday, December 4th, the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture. This year, it will be given by John Shattuck, President Emeritus of Central European University and Professor of the Practice in Diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. John is an international legal scholar, diplomat, and human rights leader. We hope everyone here will join us for the timely lecture. Thank you again, and have a wonderful alumni weekend.